Hello everybody and welcome to the Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia sponsored lecture. There is no PowerPoint. Craig tells me. Yeah, people are really enthusiastic, right? As we say in Australia, we're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed this morning. We don't know why we say this in Australia. We may say it in New Zealand, but the context is everything. You do say it in New Zealand, yeah. Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Very contextual. When I drove back to the hotel last night, there were things that I took to be possums in the car headlights. Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and very close to death. And here we are this morning on a tour like that. PESA, P-E-S-A, the Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia has been around for 43 years, and we had our conference last month, at my university, which is the University of Melbourne. This year, in November, the conference is down the road in Hamilton. So I encourage you to look at the PESA website for the 44th annual conference of PESA. PESA is delighted to sponsor this lecture this morning, that Craig will give very shortly. It's important to note that he's the Professor of Cultural Theory and Intellectual History at the University of Sheffield and has been at Sheffield since 1997. And he's the Director of the Bakhtin Centre there. And he suggests that people look at the website. You will find on the website lots of goodies, but in particular a couple of mailing lists. There's one that you might like to sign up for news, but there's also one you might like to sign up for and participate in discussions. So see him, look on the website. Bakhtin Centre at Sheffield is where it's all happening. Craig's background is, and indeed his foreground and possibly his future, is in Russian intellectual environment between 1920 and 1930. Emerging theories of language and culture in those decades, which I learned are early Soviet decades. I stand before you as a Bakhtin novice. I'm not at all a Bakhtinian expert. I'm a Wittgensteinian. He's interested in the interaction between Marxism, phenomenology, Gestalt theory, and various linguistic and social theories, and of course, Vygotsky's important there in the Bakhtin circle. In particular, he's interested in the way there are changing contexts having an effect on those sorts of ideas. And I warm to that as a Wittgensteinian because, as you know, Ludwig was famous for putting out, in his later years, the whole of the forms of life. And the whole goldfish bowl idea that we are in the goldfish bowl, we don't know ourselves to be in the goldfish bowl. This is the way the world is, folks. So context is the shape of the world, and language is part of that practice that shape us. So as a Wittgensteinian, I'm warming to Bakhtin, and we'll see how we are by Sunday evening. It was particularly important to pick up from Rupert's lecture here last night, the attention he gave to attention. Because Wittgenstein says throughout his later writings, if we want to bring something to a point of discrimination, such as through teaching, we actually focus people's attention on things. And consciousness is a way of giving boundaries to the whole booming, buzzing, massive experience. So I'm warming to Bakhtin, and we're going to hear in the next hour, I think, a lecture on Bakhtinian pedagogy in historical perspective. And if you look at the abstract, you'll see that at several points, Craig has problematized particular relationships that were emerging in the 1920s and 30s in the intellectual milieu of which he was a part. So I'm personally quite enthusiastic about this topic and hearing Craig speak. If you finally want to pick up on what PESA's doing, we own this journal, Education, Philosophy and Theory. We own it. It's a terrific journal. It's running at 12 issues a year, this year 14 issues. Published by Routledge. All the metrics are saying this is a top-tier journal. The latest issue I'm holding in my hand for December has, amongst its very, very many glories, a paper on Bakhtin. Bring it to your attention. I turned out to be the guest editor of this, so it was quite courageous of me to put it in and not have been an expert on Bakhtin. We invite contributions to EPAT. Okay? We're very keen on that. So look on the website for EPAT as well as for the Bakhtin Centre at Sheffield. You can see we have an eminent scholar here. He has a bit of a sniffle. He's got a box of tissues. There is no PowerPoint, and he'll speak from a text for about 45 minutes, and then I'll be happy to share questions, and then we'll be able to get into morning tea after 10 o'clock. I'd like you all to join me in welcoming all the way from the UK, Professor Craig Brandist, to give us the PISA lecture on bacterian pedagogy in a historical perspective.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction, and to everyone for their efforts in getting me here, which I much appreciated. I was aware that here is likely to be an audience with a good deal of experience in pedagogical questions and so on, and we're interested in that team from that perspective. And I chose to compose today's lecture on that basis, because in recent times, quite clearly, Bakhtin's circle has received considerable attention within educational theory, and a reception of this kind has been particularly productive, I think, in Brazil, where scholars working in applied linguistics have found much in the work of Voloshinov and Bakhtin to help them discuss ways in which educational practice may be adapted to the needs of less privileged parts of society. There's quite a Bakhtin industry in Brazil these days, as those of you who will attend the Stockholm conference in July will no doubt encounter. Ideas about dialogue and speech genres have proven particularly productive in this area, and it's undeniable that some significant work is taking place. And the appearance of Jane White and Michael Peters' collection on Bakhtinian pedagogy has shown the productivity of Bakhtinian categories in educational studies more broadly, and has tried to employ the critical force of the ideas by framing educational practice with a dialogical imperative. And today I'm going to expand somewhat on the preface I wrote for that worthy volume, taking a step back from the application of ideas to consider the place of educational process in Bakhtin's own work, and to set some of his perspectives within a historical framework. And this, I think, allows us better to perceive the potentialities and the limitations of the ideas, illuminating the areas that they allow us to explore and some of the aspects that need to be overcome if we're going to facilitate progress. Now, Bakhtin's most significant reflections on the question of education deal not with institutionally positioned pedagogy as such. In fact, there's only really one essay that deals with this, and I don't think it's a particularly important essay in Bakhtin's oeuvre, but with more general processes of personal and cultural maturation. The Russian term for education, the Russian terms for education, vospitania and obrazovania, literally upbringing and formation, are employed by Bakhtin in a more general discussion of individual and cultural development that generally goes under the German term Bildung. This describes a set of synchronous unifications and harmonisations, the mind and heart of the individual and the personal identity of the individual with a broader society. There's an important Hegelian background to these works. In Hegel's work, Bildung is not so much a theory as an operative concept, at times meaning different things. At least three different meanings we can find in Hegel's work. One would be the process through which the uncultivated individual can reach the standpoint of contemporary science. Secondly, it's used as the history of the world as formative cultivation of consciousness, as Hegel puts it, this Bildungsgeschichte, and as a characteristic of emerging modernity. So there's three different ways in which Hegel uses it. The process of personal growth is, therefore, synchronous with the development of society from its primitive natural state to a fully developed and articulated whole in which individuals are integrated as critical and active subjects without any detriment to their specificity. And this involves a movement from mute identity to full articulate identity, from a mere natural consciousness, through the veil of alienation, through the reunified and developed self. And Bakhtin describes this experience in distinctly Hegelian fashion, writing in the article on the chronotope about how the organic world becomes replaced by what he calls an abstract world, in which people are out of contact with each other, egotistically sealed off from each other, greedily practical. And this needs to be overcome at a higher level. Being educated means, for Hegel, an ability to comprehend the thought and standpoint of others, learning broader horizons, internalising what originally appeared alien, cultivating the imagination, intellectual labour, developing and realising one's own abilities. And really, we see the novel playing a role in society in Bakhtin's work that is parallel to much of this. Now, the educational institutional understanding of Bildung came via the German philosopher and statesman Wilhelm von Humboldt, who viewed Bildung as a process of cultivation, so that the individual cultivates him or herself within the realisation of humanity's development as a whole. The Hellenic model, the example of ancient Greece, was for Humboldt, as it was for Bakhtin, of course, crucial. Talking about von Humboldt, Stefan Arvidsson puts it, he believed that through the cultivation of Greek virtues, the German bourgeoisie could lead the German states away from feudal power and life systems without being involved in bloody and plebeian experiments of the type that had followed the French Revolution. The Humboldtian education system would thereby inoculate public officials against cowardly conservatism and rash insanity. But Humboldtian Bildung clearly involves a process of free and investigative and intensive interaction between the individual and the world that goes beyond the usual sense of education. Therefore, Humboldt regarded a successful process of Bildung to be, and I quote, a permanent enrichment of the individual through his or her continuous efforts to acquire as much of the world as possible. Crucial here, however, is that as for Hegel, Bildung for von Humboldt meant overcoming the mere accumulation of single things, and for each thing to be assimilated as part of a unity. The relation between part and whole, in this sense, is one that permeates Bakhtin's work. The fragmentation of the cognised world, which need to be transcended, was, for Bakhtin, the result of the differentiation and mechanisation of labour. Again, in the Chronotope essay, where objects are alienated from the labour that produced them. Overcoming this meant, says Bakhtin, assembling a new greater world on a new basis of rendering it familiar and humanising it. For Bakhtin, as for von Humboldt, the allness, Allheit in German, of all things, is the only subject towards which the process of Bildung must be directed. When either thinker speaks of the world that is to be acquired, this refers not simply to nature, but to something more all-encompassing. The indefinable centre towards which all particular languages and cultures are directed. From Herder, von Humboldt and his followers, Bakhtin took the idea that Bildung is specifically linked to the idea of language as worldview. As Humboldt had originally put it in his article on the comparative study of language and its relationship to different periods of language development, thought is not only dependent on language in general, but to a considerable extent on each individual language. No single language can grasp the world in its entirety, but each approaches the world in its own unique way. Language is famously for Humboldt at once energia and ergon, formative activity and product of such activity. Subjective activity fashions, this is the term bildet, the object in thought, forming concepts, Bildungsbegriffs, which become embedded in the collective memory of speech and are handed down from generation to generation as culture. And this process was generally spontaneous and lacked self-conscious reflection. And basing his ideas on the presuppositions of German Romanticism, Von Humboldt argued that it was only through the nation that the world as a whole could be approached. For each nation, allegedly, develops its own language and culture, and so develops its own collective psychology. But while this Volkspsychologie, collective psychology, was indispensable, it was only a precursor to a higher stage in the mental development of the human species, to move from the spontaneous process of concept and language formation to build on as a self-conscious process of education, formation and cultivation. And this requires bringing together and translating between as many perspectives and articulations as possible, enabling the transcendence of particular and context-bound horizons embodied in particular languages and for the universal meanings to be grasped. This lies behind von Humboldt's championing of the comparative study of languages as a crucial dimension of building. The development of the self is, for Humboldt, inherently interwoven with the opening of the world horizon of meanings by and for the self. A subsequent comparative philology was heralded as a means to free thought from what the German Sanskritologist Max Muller called the disease of language, in which original meanings of metaphors and images had been forgotten and had led humanity into superstition. Philology thus carried out a scientific critique of the mythical forms that had ensnared thought. In so doing, it demonstrated the presence of, and this is a quotation from Max Muller, the presence of the divine scattered through nature. And this would ultimately reveal Christianity as the unconscious goal of all humanity. Such reflections were immediately entangled in the ideological dichotomy of Aryans and Indo-Europeans and Semites that permeated philology at the time, and the whole notion of Indo-European philology as justifying especially the particular qualities of German national psyche came right from this, and the idea that you could find the Sanskrit roots of German culture that would actually show that European culture was not fundamentally reliant on Semitic cultures. This was some of these anti-Semitic discourse that ran through late 19th century philology. In Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, this post-Humboldtian Volkspsychologie was very influential. But the assumed link between nation, language and worldview began to come apart. Perhaps the most significant sign of this was the Polish-Russian linguist Jan Baudouin de Courtenay 1904 essay Jazyk i Jazyki, Language and Languages, in which the social stratification of the national language and the various social functions that languages play in society was foregrounded. Language, or speech, reflects various worldviews and moods of both individuals and whole groups of people, Baudouin de Courtenay argued. But these were clearly not limited to nations. Unfortunately, however, Baudouin de Courtenay took the Volkspsychologische notion of nation as the prototype for all social groups. But after the revolution, this psychologistic basis of such ideas was replaced by institutional stratification, and the irreducible forms of social interaction were highlighted. By the time that Bakhtin began to recast his early phenomenology of relations between author and hero into discursive terms at the end of the 1920s, the sociologization of the Humboldtian view of language as worldview was commonplace in Soviet linguistic thought. Just to take one example, in her 1926 book, Jazyk i Общество, Language and Society, the linguist Rosalia Shaw argued the following, and I quote, "If language is a social phenomenon, if it is the necessary precondition and tool of social intercourse, if the environment within which language in which and through which language is maintained and passed on is a social environment, then it's obvious that any kind of social differentiation must be reflected in linguistic differentiation. By the mid-1930s, the relationship between national and social linguistic forms were being discussed with considerable historical specificity and theoretical insight. One of the most prominent contributions was Victor Jamunski's 1936 book, Nationalny jazyki socjalne i dialekty, National Language and Social Dialects. And I've got a quotation from Jamunski. Jamunski says, alongside the language of the ruling classes, which is the ruling language of a given society, there are other social dialects, various peasant dialects, colloquial speech of the middle class, the dialectally coloured language of workers. On the whole, the characteristic of the linguistic development of capitalist society is its essential, and here he uses the term dvujazychia, which literally means bilingualism, but what he actually means here is what in contemporary sociolinguistics is called diglossia. And he glosses this: the unitary language of the ruling class, which is the common national literary language, is in contrast with the territorially scattered dialects of subordinate social groups. So Soviet linguists had clearly made considerable advances in expunging the romantic, psychologistic elements of the Humboldtian conception of language. But most retained the identity of language and worldview, such that the social dialects and socially coloured forms of language manifest traces of social worldview of the speaker. Now, there's a recently published version of one of Bakhtin's most important essays in Russian, Slovo v Romania, has been translated as Discourse in the Novel, which shows, and the new version shows considerable differences from that which forms the basis of the severely flawed English translation. And this makes the connections between Bakhtin's own conception of raznorechia, or heteroglossia, and that found in Jamunski's book that I just quoted from, quite explicit. In Bakhtin's analysis, however, the historical specificity of the relationship between social structure and linguistic stratification, is severely weakened, with historical development becoming a mere precondition for discursive interaction. Nevertheless, there are some intriguing passages. Commercial capitalism and the centralising energy of absolutism, says Bakhtin in the new version, brings about a new interaction and interanimation of languages that makes possible a shift from the spontaneous formation of socio-specific worldviews to a self-conscious mediation between different languages, and so the transcendence of the contact-bound horizons embodied in particular languages. This process of Bildung takes place in and through the rise of what Bakhtin calls the second stylistic line of the novel, in which, as Bakhtin often argues, in strikingly Hegelian form, the essence of the novel finally appears. And in this, he includes things like Cervantes' Don Quixote and other books. The novel now reflects upon what he calls the interaction and interanimation of languages and perspectives. The socially stratified national language, heteroglossia, raznorechia, now becomes a transition from, and I quote, a state of being in itself, when languages do not acknowledge each other or are capable of ignoring each other, to a state of being for itself, when heteroglot languages mutually reveal each other's presence and begin to function as dialogizing backgrounds. Languages of heteroglossia, like mirrors that face each other, each reflecting in its own way a little piece, a little corner of the world, force us to guess at or grasp for a world behind their mutually reflecting aspects that is broader, more multi-leveled, containing more and varied horizons than would be available to a single language or single mirror. While the old ruling class encountered only peripheral elements of other classes, says Bakhtin, social groups that were reaching a state of self-consciousness and rising to dominance came into contact with, clashed with, and mingled with elements of other social groups more closely and essentially. These groups, which comprise the rising bourgeoisie, grasped the process of becoming, the Russian term is становление, most powerfully and essentially. and it was among these groups that the novel reached its most essential form. For Bakhtin, in Discourse in the Novel, therefore, the novel combines some essential functions of Hegel's vision of philosophy and von Humboldt's vision of comparative philology as a crucial organ of Bildung. The rise of the novel as an organ of Bildung involves the breaking down of linguistic and ideological parochialism, of the enclosure of the subject in his or her own little corner of the world. The novels of the so-called first line, the chivalric novel in verse, the pastoral novel, the baroque novel, were all forms able to achieve this status because they were limited to parochial worldviews of the, I quote, stagnant nucleus of the ruling class. Novels of the second line criticised this relationship to the world, expressed in the author's dogmatic insistence that his or her little corner of the world is the most valuable and true. Bakhtin again sounds profoundly Hegelian here, for the social groups among whom the second type of novel emerges have a greater capacity for assimilation of the common general stock of attitudes and aptitudes, ideas and values which are formed in the individuals because they live in one historical world. And this is a world not of neutral independent objects, but of so-called objectivizations that exist only through individuals' participatory activities. These make meaningful communication and mutual understanding between members of society possible. Through Hegel, But what for Hegel, assimilation occurs by virtue of the individual's inescapable participation in the pervasive social institutions of the time. For Bakhtin, these participatory activities are much less clearly positioned in institutions. Rather, it's the novelist, the relatively detached intellectual reflecting on the interaction of perspectives, who plays an educative role in raising the self-consciousness of society, overcoming the fragmentation of the social world. The veil of alienation does not require the transcendence, for Bakhtin, of the division of labour or the direct participation of the masses in institutions of government, but only for the interaction of perspectives to be mediated by the intellectual who can achieve intuitions of the whole. One of the main reasons for this is the continuing influence of Marburg neo-Kantianism on Bakhtin's thought. And the neo-Kantian who wrote most about the process of Bildung was Paul Natorp, whose work on social pedagogy was widely received in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. Several of Natorp's works on the question were translated into Russian, and Matvey Kagan, who studied under Hermann Cohen with Natorp in Marburg, was translating Natorp's 1920 work on social idealism into Russian when he was attending meetings of what later became known as the Bakhtin Circle. Natorp divided the social whole into three functions. Firstly, life-renewing organisation and economy. Secondly, life-securing organisation, and by this he meant legislature, administration, regulation, government, and so on. And finally, cognition striving for truth and broadening knowledge. And this third function is Bildung. And should not only be independent from economic and political functions, but should subordinate the other two, so that, and I quote, any economic work and any social regulation, that is politics, should be but a means to the final end of Menschenbildung, of human education. Natorp, a liberal socialist, had in mind here the freeing of Humboldtian education from class privilege and extrinsic economic or political goals under capitalism. And that these, he thought, could be achieved without revolutionary transformation. Instead, pedagogy must become social pedagogy, sozialpädagogik, that studies the educational conditions of social life, as he puts it. For the social form is subject to development, while the educational ideal is not, he said. And this followed on from the neo-Kantian principle that the world is something created by human cognition, that the world is, in essence, culture. The question of how this world is to be cognised and thus created. Philosophy provides the answer, and it becomes effective in society through socio-pedagogic, which should be based on the laws that derive from the quasi-Platonic realm of validity that's independent of any process of cognition, as found in ethics, logic, and aesthetics. The realm of validity now occupies the same space as the religious idea of God, as the ideal for which men can strive, generating laws to govern conduct, and in so doing form community, Gemeinschaft, in the present. Like his colleague, the neo-Kantian Jew Hermann Cohen, and like the other Protestant thinkers of recent times, then Friedrich Schlegel, Max Muller, then the Protestant Nato, regarded monotheism as crucial in this regard. For in making God immanent and thus reachable, pantheism removed the idea of the transcendental for which people could strive. Allegedly, this led to hedonism, egotism, and chaos. It also lacks any stable defences against materialism and atheism, which for Nato was the biggest threat. Like Max Muller, therefore, Nato dreamed of an ideology that could include both science and piety, Aryan and Semitic. God would be reconciled with reason, nature with culture, modernisation with morality. It's not any one religion that can serve this function, but what Nato called religion within the limits of reason alone. Common moral and emotional bonds that transcend confessional schisms, and lead to a universal fraternity. And this is probably what Bakhtin had in mind when he distinguishes between a particular faith and what he calls Chuvstvovere, the feeling for faith. What follows from this is that Bildung is no longer embedded in the mutual adaptation of social institutions and the individual, but in the adaptation of forms of cognition to, and I quote, something that philosophy, rational thought, can only vaguely anticipate, but what can be articulated or grasped only through religious insight. And in engineering of social reality accordingly. As Sebastian Luft argues in an interesting article, the philosopher for Nato now becomes a rational prophet, providing intimations of the ultimate meaning of history. And here Natok's faith in the symphonic unity of mankind that can be intimated by the philosopher sounds very close to Max Muller's vocation for the philologist, and as we shall see, it was equally open to ideological employment. In literature, this perspective, subspecies eternitatis, that is under the aspect of eternity, is provided by the author, who views the meaning of the whole from without. And the phenomenology of this is the main point of Bakhtin's essay of the mid-1920s, Author and Hero and Aesthetic Activity. Here there's no concern with intersecting and interanimating languages. There are only discussions of the modalities between author and hero with the aim that the former should view the world through the limited perspective of the latter before returning to the position outside the open event of being, bestow closure, completion and judgment. Here there's no consideration of the difference between epic and novelistic modalities of authorship, but only of the author to transcend the limited perspectives of the heroes, to provide to provide an external perspective that gives meaning to the whole. The specificity of the novelistic relation to multiple languages and perspectives that we see in discourse in the novel recedes from view here, and in the essay on the chronotype, is also completely absent from the surviving portions of the work on the Bildungsroman of the late 1930s, where the novel becomes a variety of epic narrative, Bakhtin says this explicitly. Here in the Bildungsroman, Goethe is able to transcend the phenomenal world, to intuit the noumenal world in phenomena, as Bakhtin puts it, to see time in space. And to detect the traces of becoming that permeate the landscape. And my good friend Galin Takhanov notes that Bakhtin, the true features of Bildung here are the coincidence of essence and phenomenon, of subject and object in the act of seeing. The overcoming of alienation consists in the perception of time and space in the variegated forms of landscape, and of past and present and the artefacts of human labour. Now, returning to Nuttall, we can see a combination of Plato's ideal of the state governed by philosopher-teachers with the pedagogical ideas of the romantic educational theorists, particularly those of the Swiss pedagogue Johann Pestalozzi, whose work he championed. Individual and social ethics, individual and social pedagogy are now one and the same. Instead of philosophers as governors, philosophy becomes the inner concept of spiritual creation, and this should be the governing principle of society and the basis of law within humanity. I quote, a natural drive to move from the is, sein, to the ought, sollen. Of course, such a philosophy needs bearers. And Pestalozzi saw this in the intellectual minority who rise above the norm, who have a responsibility to improve the lot of the poor through education. From here, one can appreciate Hegel's critique of Pestalozzi and of Rousseau for their expectations that the inequities of society could be addressed through what Hegel scathingly calls pedagogical philanthropism. This is an outsideness motivated by love for those less fortunate, compassion, the conscious recognition of a principle that has come down to us from religion. Importantly, however, there's no reciprocity in the model. To paraphrase Marx's third thesis on Feuerbach, society is divided into two parts, one of which is superior to society. If there's any education for the educators, it is through the development of mathematics and the grasping of the quasi-Platonic realm of objective validity. Nuttall inherited this pedagogical philanthropism in the context of what he and many German philosophers at the time regarded as the crisis of humanity that had arisen because of the process of the production of the world had gone awry. For Nuttall, European societies have become dominated by French and British civilization. This notion, the opposition between civilization and Kultur in German philosophy at this time, very important. French and German civilization. This means externally framed rules of conduct rather than the internal spiritual cause of Kultur, of culture, in shaping the eternal future. It was the German people who had attempted to become a nation by moving beyond mere civilization to a special culture no longer bound by mere Germanness, but to become a Weltvolk, a people of the world. This, he argued, ultimately led to the 1914-1918 war, which was a just war for Nuttall because, despite the horrors, it was driven by a larger goal for universal peace and harmony through culture. So Germans felt, and I quote, like God's warriors against a world of devils, like those who have now been given the task to fulfill all the great prophecies concerning mankind. While to its participants the war was experienced as an atrocity, from the point of view of eternity, the place in the larger scheme now became clear. While it was first recognised by philosophers, this mission became clear to everyone in the course of the conflict. And in the wake of the defeat of the German people, the German people have the chance to emerge from the depths of crisis and reconstitute the state as a, quote, I quote, state of human culture through a new trinity of economy, justice and pedagogy that constitute the true state according to the guidelines of social idealism. Here one can clearly see the extent to which Nuttall, like many other philosophers of the time, including the other main source of Bachtin's phenomenology of alterity, Max Scheler, imbibed the main features of German nationalist ideology. Not only did it prevent them from perceiving the struggle over raw materials and markets that actually lay behind the war, but it was disastrously to misunderstand the relationship between state, economy and ideology as the interwar years were to make very clear. Moreover, as the main academic philosophers of the time, neo-Kantians maintained an extremely naive understanding of the relationship between academic life and the production of scientific knowledge, propagating the myth of the disinterested professor who pursues truth without fear or favour. But in the wake of the Russian Revolution, it's understandable that ideas about social pedagogy appear to make some sense. While it was clearly fanciful to expect the capitalist class to subordinate its economy and state to the interests of universal education, the Bildung of the masses, the same was not true of what could be expected in a post-revolutionary state. Some of the early activities of what became known as the Bakhtin Circle were associated with the democratization of education that followed the wake of the 1970s revolutions. Pavel Medvedev was made the rector of the first Narodny and later Proletarsky, this is People's and then Proletarian University in Vitebsk, at a time when he, Voloshinov, Pompiansky and Bakhtin were meeting informally to discuss philosophical questions. Not only was there a massive opening of the education system to the masses and a huge expansion of the number of schools, the entire curriculum was transformed in order to achieve the very goals of Bildung that Hegel and Humboldt had envisaged. It was Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, who played a leading role in the Commissariat of Enlightenment, argued that the sole objective of the socialist school was to facilitate the formation of individuality, the complete all-round development of the pupil, in a society that, unlike the capitalist world, did not deprive the individuals of the fruits of his or her education as soon as he or she leaves the school. The division of labour would gradually be overcome through young people, as young people were educated to the point where they attained practical mastery of the whole system of production. It was for this reason that early Soviet educationalists turned to the ideas of John Dewey, who had developed experimental curricula to achieve the goals of Bildung. Dewey, to a large extent, a Hegelian thinker. The entire spirit of the school would be renewed through the affiliation of school and life, so that activity schools would teach a range of practical skills, not as mere modes of routine employment, but as, I quote, active centres of scientific insight into natural materials and processes, points of departure whence children shall be led into a realisation of the historical development of man. Dewey's theories of education permeate the works of most Soviet educationalists of the 1920s, and were fundamental points of reference for policymakers who were keen to learn from some of the radical practices introduced into some US schools. Although these are some correspondences to Natorp's theory of social pedagogy, Dewey was especially critical of neo-Kantianism from a Hegelian standpoint, and the complex and project methods that were adopted by Soviet educationalists directly challenged the disciplinary boundaries that neo-Kantianism assumed and sought not only to preserve, but to make more rigorous and methodologically strict. Correspondingly, Dewey viewed agency as, and I quote, an ontological characteristic of all beings, and it is exercised in a variety of processes that are both linguistic and physical. That is, in the process of human and non-human entities, resistance or conformity to others, they transform and are transformed by them, sometimes in minute and other times in gross and more perceptible ways. But as an idealist, Bakhtin doesn't know this sensuous, real sensuous activity as such. Forms of agency that yield knowledge are either dialogical speech acts of one form or another, or the intellectual, or for the intellectual, supremely monological acts of seeing, through which meaning is bestowed upon the world. Now, progressive education reforms these days are under fire from the right in many countries, where common argument is that they fail to achieve the levels of literacy and numeracy needed for a contemporary workplace. They'd also run aground in the USSR by the beginning of the 1930s, where Stalinist bureaucrats marshalled exactly the same arguments. The reason for this failure of such practices to achieve the laudable aims of going beyond training the workplace is not a result of a misguided attempt to abandon traditional academic disciplines. We all know that the most interesting research takes place on the borders of disciplines, but the institutional subordination of education and other social institutions to the need of capital accumulation. This is as true today of today's market-dominated societies as the bureaucratic state capitalism of the USSR from the end of the 20s, in which production was subordinated to capital accumulation driven by military competition. Natorp and Dewey both underestimated the autonomy of education from such controls, and Natorp's suggestion that economics can be subordinated to universal Bildung without a thoroughgoing transformation of the means of production is unfortunately a pipe dream that Bakhtin seems to have inherited. One might consider Max Horkheimer's contention that disciplinary boundaries rationalised by neo-Kantianism recapitulate the capitalist division of labour with a harmonious balance between supply and demand as its goal. In this context, one might view Bakhtin's attempt to separate the natural and human sciences according to a methodological distinction between a monologic and a dialogic as an attempt to mark out a socially effective role for traditional intellectuals in Soviet society in providing a basis for a well-grounded building for the masses, for it is these would-be philosopher pedagogues that would have intimations of the noumenal world through their powers of seeing. And here I think we see the limitations of Bakhtin's conception of building. But without going into the realm of institutional critique and political, socio-political organisation, the potential of any dialogic pedagogy will always retreat before the economic and political agenda of a system that's not only indifferent to the universal aims of Bildung, but hostile to the production of critical thinkers who are able to perceive their shared interests lying in a fundamental transformation beyond the realms of capital accumulation. Thank you very much.
Greg promised 45 and he delivered 45, so we've got 10 minutes of discussion. I'm looking for an opening point from anybody. Okay, over here, I don't know names, but go ahead.
Yeah, my name's David Kellogg. I've got two opening points, possible opening points. One is that you seem to be arguing that you know that some of the Bakhtin's later collaborators, like Pajnov, attempted to interpret Bakhtin's work in a very Slavophilic manner, as close to the Russian Orthodox Church, and as the anti-Semitism that you briefly touched on, which was German anti-Semitism, has been slightly reinterpreted as a kind of Slavs versus Semites rather than Germans versus Semites. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on where Bakhtin stood on this. Was he more of a Slavophile or was he more of a Germanophile? Because we're talking about a period where it would have made a difference in that environment. And the second comment I have to do, the second point of entry I'd like to hear you discuss is, you talked about how the complex-oriented and activity-oriented labor schools that were championed by people like Blonsky and why not Vygotsky had to give way in the early 1930s to a much more concept-oriented form of education. And I thought your parallel with current drives to make education kind of accountable was very apropos here. Do you think the zone of proximal development and Vygotsky's later work on concept-based education was part of that, was an adjustment to, was a kind of an adaptation to precisely that Stalin's drive?
Okay, thank you. Good questions. Bakhtin Slavophile, I don't think so. Germanophile, not especially. I think Bakhtin was very much a kind of, in the 1920s, 1930s at least, very much a kind of liberal in the German sense of looking for enlightenment and popular development, a general kind of liberal with a small element approach to social transformation, liberal socialist approach to social transformation. Bakhtin clearly has no anti-Semitism, and I think there's no evidence that there's anything anti-Semitic. I mean, his best friend in the 1920s was Matvei Kagan, and Kagan, of course, probably introduced Bakhtin to many of the ideas of the Marburg School, and clearly right up into the 1930s they were very close friends until Kagan died, although they didn't see each other very much because of Bakhtin's was not allowed to live in Moscow at that time. So there is a history behind this in terms of Kozhinov and so on, and that is that some of the editors who controlled Bakhtin's archive after his death were anti-Semitic. There's no doubt about that. And Bakhtin was pretty bad about his own footnotes, but they actually removed some of the footnotes that did exist that had references to German Jewish sources. But Bakhtin's work is relevant with debts to German Jewish sources, not least Hermann Cohen, Ernst Cassirer, and Gil Zimmel, among others. Interesting then, the other question about Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development. Most of these ideas originally arise in the period immediately after the Civil War, where they're dealing with large numbers of traumatized street children that were flooding Moscow and the major cities at the time, and there was a very severe famine and so on. And what they were trying to do, and why they were funded and so on, was that they were initially trying to provide institutional frameworks in which these people could be reintegrated into society, could be involved in, or could achieve a level of social development that was open to people in society that were coming through more stable backgrounds. And this was where much of the research projects, those collective research projects in which Vygotsky and others were involved, originated. In terms of the extent to which they then became more subordinated to the Stalinist environment, Vygotsky not to a considerable extent, although there are considerable questions about the work that he and Luria tried to do in Central Asia and the rather Eurocentric aspects of that. But certainly much in Soviet psychology at the time did start to subordinate itself to such matters. And the very fact that they were trying to provide this this arena within which people could achieve social development regardless of their social background, I think shouldn't be too closely tied into those periods of degeneration of the Russian Revolution, though they obviously are not indifferent to them.
We have a reflective space, which is terrific, but if anybody wants to fill it with a question, feel free.
If there's nobody else, I
have a follow-on. Go ahead.
So I have a follow-on. If you read Thinking in Speech, you notice there's a huge gap between Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. Whereas Chapter 5 is very complex-oriented, it's very activity-oriented, it's very labor-oriented. Chapter 6 is very concept-oriented and quite ambitious from a pedagogical point of view. So for example, Vygotsky is trying to teach second graders concepts like exploitation, oppression, civil war, and revolution, which is part of the new social science curriculum. So my question was really, was the ZPD, the Zone of Proximal Development, which Vygotsky doesn't actually formulate until 1932, was that connected with the Stalinist educational stachnativism, which was the sort of the, well, you know what I mean.
Yeah. I don't know, to be honest, and that's something that's worthy of investigation. Certainly they were trying to hothouse people through the education system as quickly as possible at that time. But I don't know, I think it's difficult with Vygotsky. Apart from something like Thinking in Speech was actually dictated by Vygotsky while he was dying of tuberculosis. It is really quite difficult to know how to interpret some of these aspects of his texts, I think. Certainly if one goes from there, I think one of the things that we probably do need to be conscious of is that none of these works, Bakhtin's, Voloshinov's, or anything like this, are really understandable outside of the framework of the Soviet collective research projects that institutions had to engage in the 1920s and 1930s. And this is a historical, institutional question that needs considerable archival research to be able to judge that. I can't make any, I wouldn't want to make any generalised statements that are more definitive than that.
Eugene?
Yes, I have a question, and I don't know, Jack, if you know about that. I don't know much about that. One thing that we might disagree about importance of his article, Bakhtin's article about educational article. But one thing is I always wondered, Bakhtin for a long time was educator himself, on different levels, at the university level, at the actually middle school and high school level, which is short during war. Do you know anything, what was his pedagogy, or come across of that? Like what was his personal practice? You know, not just intellectual discussion.
Yeah, there isn't a great deal of information about that, except the notes of some of his pupils from his students from the North India Pedagogical Institute about his lectures on world literature and so on. And there are, a few anecdotal things about him getting very excited and throwing away his stick and hopping around, getting particularly excited about some pieces of literature. I mean, this is as much as we know, really. I haven't seen anything systematic on those questions. Interesting questions as they are, as you rightly say, he was clearly involved in this from a good portion of his life, and it's interesting that there aren't more reflections on this. I wonder whether there's anything in Saransk archives about these matters. There are some things about what was in his library in Saransk and so on, but I haven't seen any sustained discussion of his pedagogical practice.
I'm reminded in that question of what Wittgenstein was doing at the same time. He was teaching primary school in Austria, having fallen out with Bertrand Russell in Cambridge after World War I, gave up on academia, went to become a primary school teacher in Austria, and was a disaster. His pupils have been interviewed. He beat me. Yeah. Lasted 2 years, and the village council said, "You're out of here." And then he went back to Cambridge, and of course we all read the later Wittgenstein, which of course he didn't know he was doing at the time, but that's the one that's been influential. So yes, how these philosophers' personal pedagogies pan out in practice is a very interesting and complex question, Eugene. We might have one last comment, and then we'll have morning tea.
I'm just going to comment to Ben Wittgenstein by saying he only beat his pupils because they required him to. He probably didn't want to. Because I remember when I went to a rural school in the South Island in my very first job, the principal came and looked at these very large boys who worked on farms. He opened the desk of my drawers of the corporal point, and he said, there was a very large rawhide strap. He said, use it, you'll need to. But I wouldn't. Let's defend Wittgenstein and Bakhtin because they're responding to their conditions.
Yes. Folks, we're very grateful to Greg for a robust, scholarly and internationally focused account of very important aspects of Bakhtin's work. And on behalf of everybody, I'd like to present this just a token of our esteem on this occasion. We can sell the muffins or something like muffins. Jane, where are they available? No? Are they here somewhere? No, they're not there. They're not there? We're pointing everywhere, folks. It's morning tea time. It'll be out there somewhere. Thank you.